On the night of February the 8th, 2002, an ambulance left the gates of Kensington Palace and turned into the empty streets of West London. It was after 2 o'clock in the morning. The palace gardens were dark. The city was silent. Inside the ambulance was a 71-year-old woman who had suffered another stroke, followed by cardiac complications that the household staff could no longer manage. 2 cars followed close behind, carrying her son and her daughter, and both woken by telephone calls, both dressed in haste, both driving through streets they had known their entire lives toward a hospital they had visited too many times to count. At King Edward VII Hospital in Marylebone, the corridors were quiet. The medical team was waiting, and in the hours before dawn, while London slept, David Armstrong-Jones and Sarah Chatto sat with their mother as her breathing slowed and then stopped. She died at 6:30 in the morning. They were the only family in the room. The world would remember her as Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, the rebel, the beauty, the cautionary tale. 300 million people had watched her wedding. Millions more had watched the scandal that destroyed it. But the woman who died that February morning was not a headline. She was a mother. And the 2 people beside her had spent 40 years living inside the private reality that the public version never showed. This is the story of what that reality cost them. 2 children raised inside a royal marriage built on glamour and wrecked by betrayal, and the lives they spend the next 4 decades quietly constructing from the damage. But to understand how 2 middle-aged children came to be sitting in a private hospital room at 2:30 in the morning, holding the remnants of something that had once looked like the most glamorous royal branch in modern Britain, you have to go back. Not to the tabloid stories, not to the photographs on Mustique or the headlines about the divorce. You have to go back to the architecture of a family that was built from its very first public moment on 2 incompatible ideas about what a life inside the monarchy could be. This is the story of a side branch of the House of Windsor, a spare princess, a fashionable photographer, and the 2 children who grew up inside the weather of their contradictions. It spans 4 decades, 2 marriages, a national scandal, a long physical decline, and a final night in February that reduced everything to its simplest possible terms: a dying mother and the son and daughter who had spent their entire lives learning how to survive her. The story of David and Sarah Armstrong-Jones does not begin with their births. It begins with the particular kind of royal life their mother inherited, and the particular kind of man she chose to share it with. Princess Margaret Rose was born on the 21st of August 1930 at Glamis Castle in Scotland, the family seat of her mother's people, the Bowes Lions. She was the second daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, a couple who, at that point, occupied a comfortable and relatively unscrutinized position in the wider royal family. The Duke was the King's second son. The Duchess was a Scottish earl's daughter with charm enough to light a ballroom and steel enough to endure whatever the institution required. They were not expected to reign. Their children were not expected to carry the weight of the crown. And then, when Margaret was 6 years old, everything changed. Her uncle Edward VIII abdicated the throne for Wallis Simpson. Her father became King George VI overnight, and her elder sister Elizabeth became heir presumptive to the British Empire. In a single constitutional convulsion, the comfortable secondary branch became the main line. And Margaret, some bright, musical, sharp-tongued, 6 years old, went from being the younger daughter of a minor royal duke to being the sister of the next queen. That shift matters for everything that followed because it created the precise emotional geography her children would later inherit. Margaret was close enough to the center of the monarchy for every expectation to apply. She was visible, scrutinized, bound by the same codes of duty and restraint that governed her sister's life. But she was not the heir. She had no constitutional role. She would never reign, never occupy a position that gave her obligations a clear purpose, or her sacrifices a clear justification. She was, in the language that would later be applied to other royal figures, the spare. And being the spare in the House of Windsor meant absorbing all the cost of royalty: the public gaze, the loss of privacy, the emotional suppression, the requirement to perform composure at all times, without any of the compensating purpose that made those costs bearable for the person who wore the crown. The physical world she grew up inside shaped the code she would pass on. There was Buckingham Palace, vast and institutional, where the machinery of state hummed through corridors her family happened to live beside. There was Windsor Castle for weekends, Sandringham for Christmas, Balmoral for summer, the seasonal rotation of royal residences that imposed its own rhythm on childhood, moving the family through landscapes that were always beautiful and always formal. And there was the atmosphere inside those houses, which multiple biographers have described with a consistency that makes it credible. Warmth from the parents, genuine closeness between the sisters, but underneath it all, a code of behavior so deeply embedded that it functioned like climate. You did not discuss your feelings. You did not explain yourself to strangers. You did not allow private unhappiness to disrupt the public performance of duty. You endured. If something inside you was breaking, you broke quietly, and you broke behind doors that closed very firmly and stayed closed. Margaret's mother, later the Queen Mother, was the supreme practitioner of this code. She could radiate warmth across an entire banquet hall, making every guest feel personally attended to, while floors of emotional reality remained sealed off behind her composure. She was charm and discretion in equal measure, and the effect on her daughters was profound. Elizabeth absorbed the code and turned it into a kind of constitutional genius, a capacity for restraint that would sustain the monarchy through decades of upheaval. Margaret absorbed the code too, but it sat against her temperament like a garment cut for someone else's body. She was not built for restraint. She was built for intensity, romantic, artistic, social, emotional. And the collision between what she wanted and what the code permitted would produce the exact pattern of behavior that her children would spend their lives navigating. The setting that would become the emotional center of the story is Kensington Palace, though Margaret did not move there until after her marriage. The palace sits in the royal borough of Kensington and Chelsea, behind iron gates and high brick walls, surrounded by public gardens where tourists walk past without knowing who lives behind which set of windows. Historic royal palaces describes its long history as a residence for the monarchy's secondary branches, the youngest siblings, the widowed aunts, the cousins who were royal enough to require a palace address, but not important enough to occupy the principal residences. It is grand from the outside. Inside, it is a warren of apartments and residences, some vast and some surprisingly domestic, all of them shaped by the particular quality of living inside a palace that is not quite the palace. Margaret's apartment at Kensington, number 1A, larger than it sounds, a sprawling set of rooms on multiple floors, would become the place where her family formed, where her marriage disintegrated, where her health declined across decades, and where on the final night the telephone calls would be made and the ambulance would come. Her children grew up inside those walls. The walls saw everything, but Kensington was only the center. The orbit extended outward in every direction. Clarence's house, just across the park, was where the Queen Mother presided over her own court, more informal than the palace, more indulgent, a place where champagne flowed more freely and rules bent more easily, though the fundamental code of silence and appearances held firm. Buckingham Palace was the seat of institutional power, the place where Margaret's sister conducted the business of the crown with a discipline that made Margaret's own volatility look all the more conspicuous by contrast. Sandringham and Balmoral were the family gathering points, where cousins and uncles and aunts came together for holidays that were simultaneously intimate and governed by protocols so old that no one could remember when they had begun. David and Sarah would move through all of these settings as children, absorbing the unspoken rules of a family that operated on the hierarchies of precedence, expectation, and emotional suppression. They were royal enough for the pressures to be real. They were not royal enough for anyone to explain to them precisely what the pressures were for. The deep foundation of what those children would inherit was not wealth in the conventional sense. The Windsors did not operate like the great landed dynasties, the Devonshires, the Westminsters, the Bedfords, whose fortunes were measured in acreage and tenants and the taxable value of country estates. The royal family's wealth was institutional, tied to the civil list, to crown properties held in trust, to financial arrangements managed by the palace and the treasury. Margaret received an income. She had her apartment at Kensington. She had access to the royal household staff, its cars, its infrastructure. But she did not have an independent fortune that could absorb the costs of a separate, self-directed life. What she had was something both more valuable and more dangerous. She had the name, she had proximity, and she had the inheritance that was not money. The patterns, the silences, the emotional architecture, the expectation that appearances would be maintained long after the reality behind them had collapsed. That is what her children would receive. Not a country estate, not a trust fund that could cushion them from the world, an atmosphere. And the atmosphere in this particular branch of the Windsors was a compound of glamour, restraint, unspoken pain, and the absolute requirement to look composed while the adults around you fractured. There is something about the way that atmosphere transmitted itself that the documentary must make specific because it is the engine of the entire story. Margaret inherited duty without emotional freedom. Her children would inherit prestige without normal privacy, and their adulthood would become a long, quiet, largely successful attempt to choose craftsmanship, painting, marriage, and distance over spectacle. That is not a lesson. That is just what became necessary. But it would take decades and a great deal of damage merciless before the necessity became clear. The woman at the center of that damage was Margaret herself, and to understand her children, you must first understand her as something more than a tabloid rebel or a tragic princess. She was born with a particular set of gifts, a strong musical ear, a sharp and sometimes cruel wit, a physical beauty that photographs from every decade of her life confirm was genuine and striking, and a social magnetism that could fill a room or empty it depending on her mood. She was educated privately, as royal children of her generation were, with governesses and tutors who gave her French, music, history, and very little else. What formal education could not give her, and what the palace atmosphere actively suppressed, was a framework for managing the intensity of her own emotional life. She felt things strongly. She wanted things fiercely, and the system she lived inside had exactly one response to fierce wanting. It told you to stop. The Peter Townsend affair, which consumed her late 20s, was the foundational wound. Group Captain Peter Townsend was a decorated war hero, an equerry to her father and then to her sister, a man 16 years Margaret's senior, and he was divorced. In the 1950s, the Church of England did not sanction the remarriage of divorced persons, and the monarch was the church's supreme governor. Margaret could not marry Townsend without renouncing her position in the line of succession and forfeiting her civil list income. The crisis played out in public across months, with the press reporting every development, the establishment weighing in from every direction, and Margaret ultimately issuing a statement in October 1955 announcing that she would not marry Townsend. She was 25 years old. The statement's language was dignified. The cost was not. What the Townsend affair taught Margaret, and what her children would later absorb without ever being told directly, was that desire and duty could not coexist inside this family. You could want something with your whole self, and the institution would still require you to give it up. You could be in love, and the crown would still come first. That lesson did not make Margaret cautious. It made her reckless in the way that people become reckless when they have already lost the thing that mattered most and no longer believe the system that took it from them deserves their obedience. The man she chose instead was Anthony Armstrong-Jones, and the choice itself was a kind of statement. He was not a duke. He was not a foreign prince. He was not from any of the families whose names appeared in Debrett's or Burke's peerage as a matter of ancestral right. He was a photographer. Born on the 7th of March, 1930, the same year as Margaret, in Belgravia, the son of a barrister father and a mother from the artistically distinguished Missel family, whose brother Oliver Missel was one of the most celebrated stage designers in Britain. His parents divorced when he was young, splitting his childhood between two worlds: the legal establishment of his father's side and the theatrical, visually sophisticated, emotionally expressive world of his mother's. He contracted polio as a boy, which left one leg slightly shorter than the other, a physical reality he spent decades disguising with characteristic determination. He was educated at Eton and then Jesus College, Cambridge, where he coxed the university boat race crew and discovered, through the college's photographic society, the medium that would become his life's work. By the mid-1950s, Armstrong-Jones was one of London's most sought-after photographers. He moved through overlapping circles: Soho artists, West End actors, Mayfair Society hostesses, Chelsea bohemians, with a fluidity that was itself a talent. He could be charming in any room. He could make any subject look the way they wanted to be seen. He understood image with an intuitive precision that almost no one in the royal orbit possessed. Christie's institutional material confirms his stature as a serious artistic figure. This was not a society dilettante with a camera, but a photographer of genuine visual intelligence whose portraits would eventually hang in the National Portrait Gallery. And it was that intelligence, that capacity to see and to compose what was seen, that first brought him into Margaret's world. They were introduced in the late 1950s through mutual acquaintances in the London art scene. He photographed her. There is something almost too neat about that. The man who made images for a living, creating the first images of the woman whose public image would eventually consume them both. But the attraction was genuine and immediate. He was everything the system was not: creative, irreverent, sexually confident, physically attractive, and socially mobile in a way that must have felt like oxygen to a woman who had spent years being suffocated by protocol and denied the love she had wanted. He did not defer to her title. He did not treat her as a princess first and a person second. He treated her as a subject in the photographic sense, and then as a woman, and the distinction mattered enormously to someone who had spent her entire adult life being approached through the filter of her position. But Armstrong-Jones brought his own complications, and the documentary must not romanticize him any more than it romanticizes Margaret. And de Courcy's extensive reporting on the marriage, drawn from interviews with friends, family members, and associates, and from private correspondence that surfaced after his death, describes a man of considerable charm and considerable coldness. He could be generous, funny, wickedly observant, and deeply engaged with whoever was in front of him. He could also be cutting, competitive, sexually compulsive, and capable of a kind of emotional compartmentalization that allowed him to maintain parallel lives without apparently any great difficulty of conscience. He had maintained romantic relationships with multiple people before the engagement, including at least one that overlapped significantly with his courtship of Margaret. A pattern that suggested the restlessness was not a phase, but a permanent feature of his character. He needed novelty the way other people needed stability. He needed to be wanted by someone new. And the marriage, however sincere its beginnings, would never be able to satisfy that need for long. Surrounding these two were the figures who would define the family's wider orbit and who would shape the environment in which David and Sarah grew up as powerfully as their own parents did. Queen Elizabeth II, Margaret's elder sister, born in 1926, already more than a decade into a reign that would become the longest in British history, was the institution personified. She was not the villain of this story. She never would be. She was its constant, steady, composed, devoted to constitutional duty, with a consistency that left very little room for the emotional needs of the people closest to her. Elizabeth loved her sister. That is not in dispute. Multiple accounts confirm that the bond between them was genuine, rooted in a shared childhood and a mutual understanding of what the family demanded. But Elizabeth's response to that demand had been to absorb it completely, to become the role so thoroughly that the person inside it became almost invisible. Margaret's response had been the opposite: to fight the role, to strain against it, to insist on the primacy of her own feelings, even when the institution made clear that feelings were, at best, irrelevant. The contrast between them was not merely temperamental, it was existential. And the children who grew up watching it learned, without anyone ever sitting them down and explaining it, that there were two ways to survive inside this family. You could become the system, as Elizabeth had, or you could fight it, as Margaret did. Neither path looked from the inside like freedom. The Queen Mother occupied a different position entirely: the matriarch, the grandmother, the keeper of an older social order, in which charm was the first obligation and silence the second. She lived at Clarence House, just across the mall from Buckingham Palace, presiding over a household that was warmer, more indulgent, and more socially relaxed than the palace itself. She adored her grandchildren, David and Sarah among them, and created around herself an atmosphere of hospitality that was genuine, but also in its way strategic. The warmth was real. So was the control. The Queen Mother's generation had survived the abdication crisis, the war, the death of a king, and the complete reshaping of Britain's social order, and they had survived it by mastering the art of appearing to be open while revealing nothing that mattered. She could pour a gin and tonic, tell a story about the Blitz, make a child feel cherished, and still ensure that no one in the room mentioned the things the family had agreed wordlessly never to discuss. David and Sarah would grow up inside that warmth. They would also grow up inside the silence it required. Beyond the immediate family, There were figures whose importance would reveal itself only later. Across the decades, the documentary would track Roddy Llewellyn, the young baronet's son, whose name would become inseparable from Margaret's most public humiliation, was born in 1947 and was still a teenager when the Snowden marriage began. Years away from the Mustique photographs that would detonate the family's remaining pretense of stability. Daniel Chatto, the actor and artist who would one day marry Sarah and build with her the kind of quiet, art-centered life her parents never achieved, was growing up in an entirely separate world, connected to film and theater through his own family. Serena Stanhope, the daughter of Viscount Petersham, whom David would marry in 1993 in what appeared to be a restoration of the family's conventional aristocratic order, had not yet been born when Margaret walked down the aisle at Westminster Abbey. All of these people would eventually matter enormously. None of them mattered yet. What mattered in the spring of 1960 was the wedding and the household it would create. What mattered in 1960 was the wedding. The 6th of May, Westminster Abbey, the first royal wedding ever televised, Margaret in Norman Hartnell's gown, Armstrong-Jones in mourning dress, an estimated 300 million viewers watching worldwide, and the British press unanimous in its delight. The monarchy had never looked like this: young, photogenic, modern, artistic, sexually alive in a way the institution could market without admitting it. Armstrong-Jones was created Earl of Snowden the following year, receiving the earldom that gave the family its formal name and their son his courtesy title. The couple moved into Kensington Palace. The household began to form. And for a while, a few years, perhaps 5, perhaps fewer, the public image and the private reality were close enough to the same thing that the gap between them could be ignored. David Albert Charles Armstrong-Jones was born on the 3rd of November 1961 at Clarence House. He was styled Viscount Linley from birth, a courtesy title he would carry for decades before inheriting the earldom itself. He was a palace child, nurseries with painted ceilings, nannies in uniform, the quiet choreography of a royal household. But he was also, from his first days, the child of a photographer. Cameras were part of the furniture. The apparatus of image making, lights, lenses, the deliberate arrangement of how things looked, was not something exotic in his world. It was the family trade, or at least his father's half of it. His mother's half was duty, ceremony, and the slow public performance of being royal. Lady Sarah Frances Elizabeth Armstrong-Jones arrived on the 1st of May, 1964, and her arrival was quieter. She was the daughter. She would not inherit the title. In a family shaped by centuries of primogeniture and precedence, that distinction carried weight, even if no one spoke of it directly. But Sarah would prove, across the decades that followed, to be the family member whose trajectory most precisely answered the question at the heart of this story. What does a child do with the inheritance that is not money? What does she build from the raw material of glamour, instability, public exposure, and a mother whose beauty and appetites and damage filled every room she entered? The answer, when it eventually came, would be almost invisible from the outside. That was the point. The household at Kensington Palace in those first years occupied a strange position in the landscape of British domestic life. It was a family home inside a palace. Nurseries with high ceilings and tall windows looking out onto the palace gardens. A nanny called Verona Sumner, who provided the daily stability that the parents' schedules could not always guarantee. Meals taken at regular hours in rooms where the silver was old and the routines were older. Margaret kept the household running with the particular attention to social detail that her upbringing had drilled into her. Flowers arranged, menus planned, guest lists curated for the dinners and parties that were both social pleasure and institutional obligation. She was not an absent mother. Multiple accounts describe her as engaged, affectionate, and genuinely interested in her children's development. But she was a royal mother of the early 1960s, which meant that the structures of staff and schedule created a buffer between parent and child that later generations would find difficult to understand. The children were loved. The children. They were also managed. And the distance between the two, between being loved and being known, was something they would carry with them. Snowden, meanwhile, was building a professional life that required the one thing married domesticity inside Kensington Palace could not easily provide: freedom. His photography was not a sideline. It was ambitious, serious work. Portraits for Vogue and the Sunday Times, documentary projects, theatrical designs that drew on his uncle Oliver Messel's legacy, assignments that took him away from London for days and weeks at a time. He was appointed artistic advisor to the Sunday Times magazine, a role that gave him both creative scope and an identity separate from the palace. He needed that separateness. He was a man who thrived on new encounters, new faces, the stimulation of walking into a room where nobody knew him as the princess's husband and everyone knew him as the photographer. The title of Earl of Snowden sat on him like borrowed clothing, useful for access, respected in certain circles, but never quite the identity he would have chosen for himself. The camera was his identity. The palace was his wife's, and the space between those two identities would widen year by year until the children growing up inside it could feel the draft. What David and Sarah absorbed in those early years was not crisis, but atmosphere. Children do not need to understand the marriage to feel its temperature. David, by the accounts that exist of his early childhood, was an active, physically confident boy, interested in making things, in how objects were built and put together, in the material world of wood and design that would later define his career. Sarah was quieter, more watchful, a child who seemed to take in the room before deciding how to occupy it. She inherited her mother's interest in the visual arts and her father's instinct for observation, though in Sarah's case, the observation would turn inward, toward painting rather than photography, toward the creation of private images rather than public ones. Both children were surrounded by the extended royal family. Holidays at Sandringham meant Charles and Anne as playmates, the rituals of the Christmas table, the Boxing Day shoot, the particular combination of intimacy and hierarchy that defined royal gatherings. Both children learned, without being taught, the rules of the world they had been born into. Be polite, be composed, do not make a scene, do not ask questions about the things the adults are not discussing. Together, the family moved through a world that combined the ceremonial obligations of the monarchy with the excitement of swinging London, gallery openings, theater premieres, dinners with artists and designers, weekends at country houses, where the guest list mixed old aristocracy with new celebrity. The children grew up surrounded by this. Not merely the formality of the royal household, but the presence of photographers, designers, musicians, dancers, and creative adults who treated the making of art as serious work rather than aristocratic hobby. That environment matters because it explains something about who David and Sarah would become. They were not raised exclusively inside the rigid conventions of a traditional royal nursery, trained only for ceremonial duty and public appearances. Nor were they raised in a fully bohemian household where creativity trumped all other obligations. They were raised in both traditions simultaneously, absorbing the contradiction through the walls of Kensington Palace itself, the formal rooms and the photographic studio, the court circular diary and the Soho dinner invitations, the Windsor code of emotional suppression and the messal inheritance of artistic feeling. It was an extraordinary childhood. It was also, in ways that would only become visible later, an impossible one. Because the marriage that produced his household was already, by the mid-1960s, beginning to divide into two separate realities. There was the version the cameras saw, elegant, modern, the most photogenic couple in the royal orbit. And there was the version that existed behind the closed doors of apartment 1A, where the absences were growing longer, the silences sharper, and the pattern that would define the next decade. Affairs, loneliness, drinking, emotional withdrawal was beginning to establish itself with the quiet inevitability of weather turning. The children were small. David was 4, perhaps 5. Sarah was 2. They did not yet have words for what was shifting in the atmosphere around them, but they were breathing it in. They were absorbing it through the rhythms of a household where their father left for longer stretches, where their mother's moods swung between social brilliance and private darkness, and where the adults had begun, without anyone announcing it, to inhabit separate emotional countries within the same palace walls. The public still saw the fairy tale. The cameras still loved the couple. The marriage that 300 million people had watched begin was still, as far as the world knew, one of the great romantic successes of the modern monarchy. That version of events would hold for another decade. The version the children were living inside would not. To understand the scale of the collapse, you first have to understand the scale of what was working. And for a while, perhaps 5 years, perhaps 7, depending on how honestly you measure, the Snowden marriage was not merely surviving inside the royal system. It was, by almost any external measure, the most compelling family unit the modern monarchy had produced. The early 1960s were Margaret and Snowden's best years, and the documentary must give those years their full weight, not because the audience needs to be deceived into thinking the story ends well, but because tragedy only lands when The thing that was lost felt real. What was real in those first years was a marriage that seemed to offer something the monarchy had never managed before: glamour that was also modern, royalty that was also creative, a public image that felt alive rather than merely ceremonial. Margaret brought the institution, the title, the access, the ancient social machinery of the crown, and Snowden brought the eye. Together, they produced a version of royal life that the cameras adored and the public consumed with a hunger that had not existed before the age of television. Their social world was extraordinary in its range. A dinner at Kensington Palace in those years might include a prima ballerina from the Royal Ballet, a cabinet minister still carrying his red box, a society photographer who had once shared a darkroom with Snowden, a playwright whose latest production Margaret had attended twice, and a minor European royal passing through London on some ill-defined diplomatic errand. Margaret presided over these evenings with an energy that multiple guests have described in terms that suggest something close to performance. She was funny, she was sharp, she was capable of a warmth that made each person feel individually attended to, and she was also capable of a sudden coldness that you could empty one end of a table if the conversation failed to hold her interest. She smoked constantly, through the soup, through the fish, through the pudding, a habit that would later cost her a lung, but that in those years was simply part of the scene, the cigarette holder as much an accessory as the tiara. She drank, but in those early years the drinking was social rather than medicinal, a feature of the evening rather than its purpose. Snowden matched her socially, but differently. Where Margaret commanded a room through title and temperament, Snowden moved through it. He circulated, he charmed. He collected people, their faces, their stories, their potential as subjects, with an appetite that was both professional and personal. His photographic assignments for the Sunday Times magazine took him into worlds the palace had never touched. He photographed disability rights campaigns, social housing projects, the lives of people in post-war Britain who existed at an enormous distance from the Kensington Palace dinner table. He brought the same visual intelligence to that work that he brought to his portraits of debutantes and duchesses. And the contrast gave him a seriousness that purely society photographers did not possess. Margaret respected that seriousness. She was proud in those years to be married to a man who was not merely decorative, but who did real work in the world. That pride would curdle later when the work became an excuse for absence, and the absences became a cover for other things entirely. Margaret's own engagement with the arts was not decorative either, and the documentary should make this clear, because it matters for understanding what the children inherited. Her patronage of the Royal Ballet was built on genuine knowledge. She attended rehearsals at the Royal Opera House, understood the technical vocabulary, knew the dancers by name and by ability. She had a strong musical ear, she played the piano well and sang with confidence. And her interest in painting, theater, and literature was informed rather than performative. When she visited the gallery, she looked. When she listened to music, she heard. These were not the polite enthusiasms of a princess doing her duty by the cultural institutions of the nation. They were real passions, and they created an atmosphere in the household that would shape both David and Sarah in ways that only became visible later, when they each chose to build adult lives organized around making things rather than representing things. The children were part of this world in the way that children of prominent families are always part of it. Present, but peripheral, absorbing without fully understanding, watching the adults from a position that was simultaneously privileged and powerless. David, in his early years, was a boy who liked to use his hands. He liked to know how things were constructed, not in the abstract, but physically, materially. He was drawn to wood, to tools, to the logic of joinery and the satisfaction of a physical object that had been well made. This was not a trait that the palace establishment particularly valued or even noticed, but it was there, visible in the small projects and the curiosity about craft that characterized his childhood. It would later lead him to Bedales, to Parnham House, and to the founding of Linley. In those early years, it was simply a boy's preference for the tangible over the ceremonial. Sarah absorbed the household differently. She was the observer. She drew. She painted. She noticed the quality of light in a room, the way colors shifted as the afternoon moved toward evening, the expression on a face when the person behind it believed they were not being watched. Her artistic temperament was forming early, fed by the visual richness of her environment. Her father's photographs lining the walls, her mother's art collection, the theatrical designs that echoed through the Messel family's legacy. the dancers and painters and musicians who moved through Kensington as regular visitors. Sarah's quietness was not vacancy, it was attention. She was watching everything, and what she saw would eventually find its way onto canvas. The family's best years also had a physical geography beyond London. There were weekends at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, where the Queen Mother held court and the extended family gathered in an atmosphere of studied informality. Drinks on the terrace before lunch, walks through the gardens in the afternoon, the Queen Mother's corgis, underfoot, and her charm deployed with the same effortless precision she had been perfecting since before the war. For David and Sarah, these weekends were both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense that all children take their grandparents' houses for granted. Extraordinary in the sense that their grandmother was one of the most famous women in the world, and the house was a grace and favor royal residence with footmen in silver and paintings that belonged to the crown. They accepted it the way children accept whatever they are born into. It was simply their life. There were Christmases at Sandringham, where the rhythms of the royal holiday, the church service at St. Mary Magdalene on Christmas morning, the formal lunch in the dining room, the Queen's broadcast watched in near silence, the afternoon walk, the Boxing Day shoot, imposed a structure that left little space for the kind of a private family intimacy that ordinary households took for granted. Everything at Sandringham was communal, observed and governed by precedent. Where you sat at the table was determined by rank. What you wore was governed by convention. When you arrived and when you left was noted. For David and Sarah, these gatherings placed them inside the full machinery of the royal family. Cousins who were princes and princesses, aunts and uncles whose faces appeared on stamps and banknotes. The ever-present awareness that this family, however warm it might feel from the inside, operated on hierarchies that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with proximity to the crown. They were close, but not central, included, but not essential. That position, inside enough to absorb the pressures, outside enough to be overlooked when the pressures were distributed, would define their experience for decades. And there was Mustique, the Caribbean island the Colin Tennant had made available to Margaret, where the rules loosened and the social circle expanded to include the kind of people who would never have survived a Sandringham Christmas. Margaret had built Les Jolies Eaux there, a modest house by royal standards, designed by her uncle Oliver Messel for warmth and light rather than ceremony. And the family spent holidays in a setting that offered something Kensington Palace could never provide: genuine privacy, no courtiers, no court circular, no photographers at the gates, just sun and sea and a social scene that was bohemian, indulgent, and free from the constraints of London. The children came too, at least in the early years, and for David and Sarah, Mustique was likely the closest approximation of an ordinary family holiday they would ever experience. Swimming, exploring, the kind of unstructured time that royal life in England rarely permitted. That the island would later become the backdrop for their mother's most devastating public exposure was a cruelty that none of them could have anticipated. And the documentary should note the irony without underlining it. The place of escape became the place of entrapment. But within the best years, the cracks were already forming. There is something about the way marriages decay inside institutions that is different from ordinary domestic collapse. In a normal family, a failing marriage produces arguments, slammed doors, perhaps a move to separate bedrooms, eventually a painful but clear-eyed conversation about what comes next. In a royal family, and especially in a royal family operating under the Windsor Code of Silence and perpetual appearances, and failing marriage produces something quieter and far more insidious: parallel lives. The arguments still happen, but behind doors so thick that the household staff develop a professional deafness. The separate bedrooms appear, but the couple still attends public events arm in arm, still smiles for the cameras, still presents to the world a version of their union that has ceased to bear any relationship to the truth. The gap between performance and reality widens, not in a single dramatic rupture, but in a slow, daily accumulation of absences, silences, and small betrayals that compound like interest on a debt nobody is willing to acknowledge. And de Courcy's detailed reporting on the marriage places the beginning of this serious decline in the late 1960s, roughly 5 to 7 years after the wedding. Snowden's absences from Kensington grew longer and more frequent. His professional commitments took him away for weeks at a time, and when he returned, the household felt the change in temperature. He could be charming and fully engaged one evening, playing with the children, holding the room at dinner with an anecdote about a recent assignment, and then glacially cold the next morning, withdrawn into a silence that Margaret experienced as punishment and that the children experienced as weather they could not predict or control. He left notes for Margaret, cutting, sometimes cruel messages placed where she would find them, that multiple sources have described and that reveal a capacity for passive aggression that the public never saw. One particularly devastating detail reported by De Courcy was a note left in a book on Margaret's bedside table that read simply, "You look like a Jewish manicurist and I hate you." Whether that precise wording is verified beyond the source is uncertain. What is not in dispute is the pattern. A marriage in which tenderness and cruelty alternated with a rhythm that left neither spouse and neither child able to trust the ground beneath their feet. Snowden's affairs became more numerous and less carefully concealed as the 60s turned into the 70s. He was seen with other women at restaurants, at parties, at professional gatherings, where the social worlds overlapped enough that information traveled back to Kensington Palace with depressing regularity. The names changed, but the pattern did not. Snowden pursued new relationships with a compulsiveness that suggests the marriages were never, for him, the central fact of his emotional life. His work was the center. His appetites radiated outward from there, and the marriage occupied whatever space was left, which was increasingly very little. Margaret, who had sacrificed Peter Townsend on the altar of duty and propriety, who had given up the man she loved because the church and the crown and the establishment had demanded it, now found herself married to a man who seemed to regard fidelity as an optional feature of the arrangement. The injustice was not lost on her, nor was the irony. She had been denied Townsend because divorce was unacceptable. She was now living inside a marriage that was a divorce in everything but name. Margaret's response to the deterioration was characteristic and in its way predictable. She did not retreat into quiet suffering. She was not built for that. She intensified. She drank more. The whiskey and water that was her habitual combination flowed more freely and more frequently, and the late nights at Kensington grew longer and more demanding. Margaret required company. She required conversation, attention, the presence of other people around her to fill the space that the marriage was failing to occupy. She would keep guests until 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, the conversation ranging from ballet to politics to palace gossip to sharp, sometimes devastating observations about the people in her life. She could be brilliant during those sessions, witty, incisive, unexpectedly generous towards someone who was struggling with their own troubles. But she could also be imperious, cutting and merciless toward anyone who attempted to leave before she was ready to be alone. The duality was exhausting for everyone around her. It was especially exhausting for the children, who were old enough by the early 1970s to register the patterns. The raised voices that traveled through walls at night, the mornings when their mother's temper was short and brittle, the father who had left for an assignment that everyone understood was also an escape. They could feel the household's temperature dropping, degree by degree, even if nobody sat them down and explained why. David was entering his school years. He was sent first to Gibbs Preparatory School in London, then to Ashdown House in Sussex, and then to Bedales in Hampshire. A choice that was itself revealing. Bedales was not Eton, not Harrow, not Winchester. It was progressive, coeducational, arts-oriented, a school that valued creativity and practical skill alongside academic achievement. The choice reflected the household's values, or at least the values that the household still professed, even as the marriage that had produced those values was coming apart. At Bedales, David discovered woodwork, design, and the beginnings of the craft identity that would define his adult life. The school gave him something Kensington Palace could not, a world in which what you made with your hands mattered more than what your name entitled you to. Sarah would later attend Francis Holland School in London and then the Camberwell School of Arts and Crafts, choices that similarly prioritize artistic development over conventional aristocratic education. Both children were being given, through their schooling, an alternative identity, a way of being in the world that did not depend on the palace, the title, or the increasingly damaged family brand. But schooling could not insulate them from what was about to happen. By the mid-1970s, the marriage had deteriorated past the point where parallel lives could be quietly maintained. Margaret, lonely and increasingly reckless in the way that people become reckless when they have been hurt too many times to care about the consequences, had formed a relationship with a young man named Roddy Llewellyn. He was 25 years old when they met. In 1973, she was 43. The son of the Olympic horseman, Sir Harry Llewellyn, a man with gentle manners and interest in gardening, music, and a vague aspiration towards something in the arts that had not yet taken concrete form. He was handsome in a soft, unthreatening way that was almost the opposite of Snowden's sharp-featured intensity. He was not a predator or a fortune hunter. He was, by most accounts, genuinely fond of Margaret, perhaps even in love with her, and he offered something her marriage had long since ceased to provide: uncomplicated warmth, physical affection, the simple willingness to be present and attentive in a way that Snowden had abandoned years earlier. The relationship developed over the following 2 years, conducted with varying degrees of discretion, known to Margaret's inner circle but shielded. Everything in the royal orbit was shielded, from the press and the public. The shielding depended, as it always did, on the cooperation of the people who moved through Margaret's world, and on the traditional reluctance of the British press to intrude too aggressively into royal private life. In the mid-1970s, that reluctance was beginning to erode. The tabloid market was competitive, Fleet Street was hungry, and the combination of a princess, a younger man, and a Caribbean island was the kind of story that could sell newspapers for weeks. All it required was a photograph. That shielding ended in February 1976, and it ended not with a whisper, but with the blunt force of a tabloid front page. A New Zealand journalist named Ross Wyby obtained photographs of Margaret and Llewellyn together on Mustique, the family's island, the place of escape, the setting that had once represented everything private and free about Margaret's life. The circumstances of how the photographs were obtained have never been fully clarified, and the details matter less than their effect. The images were published in the News of the World on the 22nd of February 1976, and the detonation was immediate. They showed Margaret in a bathing costume, relaxed, apparently happy, in the company of a young man who was not her husband, on a Caribbean island that the British public associated with royal luxury, taxpayer-funded privilege, and precisely the kind of indolent glamour that played badly in a country still struggling through economic recession and industrial unrest. The timing could not have been worse. Britain in early 1976 was a country of strikes, inflation, and a Labour government fighting for its survival. The contrast between the nation's mood and the images from Mustique, a princess sunbathing, with her young lover while the country froze, was precisely the kind of story that the tabloid press existed to amplify, and amplify it they did. Front pages across Fleet Street, editorial columns thick with moral outrage, questions raised in Parliament about the cost of the princess's lifestyle to the public purse. Margaret had spent years maintaining the pretense that her private life was her own business. In a single newspaper edition, that pretense was destroyed. The palace moved to contain the damage with the only tool it possessed: a statement. On the 19th of March, 1976, Kensington Palace announced that Princess Margaret and the Earl of Snowden were to live apart. The language was characteristically bloodless. Her Royal Highness, the Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowden, and the Earl of Snowden have mutually agreed to live apart. The princess will carry out her public duties and functions unaccompanied by Lord Snowden. There are no plans for divorce proceedings. Every word was chosen to convey the minimum of information with the maximum of institutional composure. There were no accusations, no explanations, no acknowledgement of the affairs. On both sides, the years of private misery, the children caught inside the wreckage, just the clean administrative language of a family that had been managing public crises for centuries. David was 14 years old. Sarah was 11. There is something about those ages that demands the documentary stop and sit with them, because they are the heart of the story. 14 and 11. Old enough to read the newspaper stacked in the front hall. Old enough to hear the conversations in the corridors at school, to register the particular tone. Curiosity wrapped in sympathy, wrapped in something less kind, that other children used when asking about something they had seen on the front page that morning. Old enough to understand that the island where they had once built sandcastles was now being described in the press as the scene of their mother's disgrace. Old enough to feel the humiliation, not old enough to have any power over it. No voice in how the separation was announced, no say in what was printed, no way to protect themselves or their parents from the exposure that had, overnight, turned their family's worst moment into the nation's entertainment. The separation restructured everything. Snowden moved out of Kensington Palace, taking his cameras and his restlessness into a life that would rapidly fill with new relationships, new professional projects, new social worlds that no longer required the palace as a backdrop. He took a house in Launceston Place, Kensington, close enough geographically to maintain access to his children, far enough emotionally to begin constructing the separate existence he had always, in some sense, been pursuing. He did not vanish from David and Sarah's lives. He remained, by most accounts, an engaged and interested father who saw them regularly, who took genuine pride in their developing talents, and who maintained a relationship with them that, whatever its limitations, was not severed by the collapse of the marriage. But his physical departure from Kensington meant that the daily architecture of family life, the shared breakfasts, the incidental conversations in corridors, the simple presence of two parents under one roof, was gone. Kensington Palace was now Margaret's domain alone. And Margaret, in the wake of the separation, became more exposed and more vulnerable than she had ever been. The press coverage was relentless. The tabloids tracked her movements, her social engagements, her ongoing relationship with Llewellyn, her drinking, her health, her every public appearance. She was no longer the glamorous youngest sister of the Queen, the artistic princess who had enlivened the monarchy with her beauty and her modern tastes. She was the disgraced princess, the woman photographed with a younger man, the cautionary tale that the establishment had always feared she might become. The public sympathy that had once surrounded her, sympathy for the Townsend sacrifice, for the duty she had accepted at the cost of the love she had wanted, had curdled into something less generous. She was judged, and the judgment was harsh, and it came from every direction, from the press, from Parliament, from the drawing rooms of the very social world that had once courted her favor. Inside Kensington Palace, the household contracted around Margaret's pain. The staff adjusted their routines to accommodate the late nights, the unpredictable mornings, the emotional volatility that the drinking was making worse. The apartment that had once hummed with dinner parties and creative energy grew quieter in some ways and louder in others. Fewer guests, but the guests who remained stayed later, drank more, and found themselves playing a role that was part companion, part audience, and part emotional support for a woman whose distress was genuine and whose means of expressing it were becoming increasingly difficult for the people around her to manage. The children moved through this altered household with the careful attentiveness that children of troubled parents develop almost unconsciously, reading moods, gauging the safety of a room before entering it, learning when to be present and when to disappear. For David and Sarah, the separation taught a lesson that would define the rest of their adolescence, and in many ways the entire trajectory of their adult lives. They became, almost immediately, children who survived by not enlarging the scandal. They did not give interviews. They did not act out in ways that attracted press attention. They did not do any of the things that children of famous, fractured families sometimes do when the internal pressure becomes unbearable, and no public scenes, no dramatic rebellion, no visible distress that the tabloids could capture and print alongside photographs of their mother on the beach with Roddy Llewellyn. They absorbed, they composed themselves. They learned the Windsor Code not as an abstract principle inherited from their grandmother and their aunt, but as a survival strategy with immediate practical application. You endure, you keep your face still, you do not give the cameras anything they can use against you or the people you love. David, at 14, was at Bedales, where the progressive, arts-focused environment offered a kind of counter-world to the chaos at home. He threw himself into practical work, woodwork, design, the tangible satisfactions of craft that did not depend on anyone else's mood or behavior. The workshop became a refuge. What you made with your hands stayed made. It did not betray you or leave or appear on the front page of the news of the world. Sarah, at 11, was younger and more directly exposed to the household's altered atmosphere, but she too was developing the strategy that would define her adult life: observation, privacy, the cultivation of an inner world that the external chaos could not reach. She drew, she painted, she watched, and she learned, earlier than any child should have to learn, that the safest place in a family like hers was the one the cameras could not find. The fact that both David and Sarah would grow into adults defined by their discretion, their fierce protection of their private lives, and their determined refusal to become tabloid figures is not a coincidence or a personality trait that happened to emerge. It is a direct consequence of what was done to them in 1976, when they learned at 14 and 11 that the only safe response to a family crisis this public was to make yourself as quiet, as useful, and as invisible as the institution would allow. But the separation, for all its devastation, was not the end. The public believed it had already seen the worst. The tabloids had their photographs, their headlines, their editorials about the disgraced princess and the cost to the taxpayer. The story appeared to have reached its natural conclusion. A royal marriage had failed, a formal separation had been announced, and the monarchy would absorb the damage as it had absorbed every previous scandal. through silence, composure, and the passage of time. What the public could not yet see, what nobody outside Kensington Palace could yet understand, was that the real cost had barely begun to accrue. The separation was the fracture. What followed would be the long, grinding process of living inside the breakage. A divorce that would take another 2 years to formalize, Margaret's health beginning to fail in ways that bore the unmistakable signature of the drinking and the smoking that the press documented with enthusiasm, but without sympathy, and two children navigating the most vulnerable years of their adolescence, inside a household where the scaffolding of family life had been removed and nothing stable had been erected in its place. The separation had ended one story, the fairy tale marriage, the modern royal couple, the glamour that 300 million people had invested in 16 years earlier. But it had started another, and the second story was quieter, darker, and far more consequential for the two people at the center of this documentary. The nation believed the worst was over. For David and Sarah Armstrong-Jones, the worst was only beginning to take shape. The divorce, when it finally came, was not a single event, but a process. Slow, legal, administrative, conducted through solicitors and palace officials in the language of settlements and arrangements, stripped of whatever emotion had once existed between the two people at its center. The proceedings moved forward through 1977 and into 1978, and on the 11th of July, 1978, the marriage of Princess Margaret and the Earl of Snowden was formally dissolved. The decree was granted in the family division of the High Court. The hearing lasted fewer than 2 minutes. Margaret was not present. Snowden was not present. The brevity was, in its way, the most revealing detail. 16 years of marriage, 2 children, a national fairy tale, and a national scandal, and the legal system dispensed with the whole thing in less time than it took to boil an egg. David was 16. Sarah was 14. They were no longer the small children who had been caught inside the separation's blast radius 2 years earlier. They were adolescents, old enough now to understand not merely that their parents' marriage had ended, but to begin to grasp the particular shape of its failure. They could see, with the clarity that teenage years bring, the pattern that had produced the collapse. A mother who wanted loyalty and intensity from a husband who could not provide either, a father who wanted freedom from a system that had given him a title but not a purpose, and a royal machine that had absorbed the damage without ever acknowledging the human cost. The divorce freed both parents from a legal fiction. It did not free the children from the consequences. And 1978 brought something worse than legal paperwork. In the same period as the divorce proceedings, Margaret was hospitalized with what was publicly described as gastroenteritis, but what the medical record, as later confirmed by multiple sources, revealed to be alcoholic hepatitis, a diagnosis that carried a weight far beyond its clinical definition. Alcoholic hepatitis meant that the drinking, which the press had documented and the public had judged, had progressed from social habit to physiological damage. Margaret's liver was bearing the cost of years of whiskey and late nights, and the diagnosis placed her, at 47 years old, in a medical category that suggested the problem was no longer merely behavioral but organic. The body was beginning to fail. For David and Sarah, this was the moment, and though neither would have articulated it in these terms, when the story shifted from marital catastrophe to something longer, slower, and ultimately more devastating. The marriage was over, that was settled. But their mother's health was not settled, and it would not be settled for another 24 years. What began with alcoholic hepatitis in 1978 would continue through lung surgery, pneumonia, strokes, impaired mobility, and the long diminishment of a woman who had once been the most glamorous figure in the royal family. The children were no longer watching a marriage collapse. They were watching a mother deteriorate. And the two experiences, though different in their rhythms, demanded the same thing from them: composure, endurance, and the willingness to carry private pain without complaint. Snowden, freed from the marriage, moved into a new chapter of his life with the speed and decisiveness that had always characterized him. He married Lucy Lindsay Hogg in December 1978, barely 5 months after the divorce was finalized, a television production assistant he had been seeing during the final years of his marriage to Margaret. The speed of the remarriage was noted by the press and by the wider social world, with reactions that ranged from raised eyebrows to outright disapproval, though Snowden, characteristically, showed little concern for either response. He had never been a man who calibrated his choices to public opinion. He had married Margaret because he wanted to. He had conducted affairs because he wanted to, and he remarried because he wanted to, with the same decisive energy he brought to his photographic assignments and his social maneuvering. The new marriage would produce a daughter, Lady Frances Armstrong-Jones, born in 1979, which meant that David and Sarah now had a half-sister, another branch on a family tree that was becoming increasingly complicated by the consequences of adult decisions the children had never been consulted about. Snowden continued his photographic career, which remained prolific and critically respected throughout the 1970s and 80s. His portraits appeared in the Sunday Times and Vogue, in exhibitions that confirmed his standing as one of Britain's most significant photographers of the 20th century. He also continued his work on disability, producing television documentaries and photographic essays that drew attention to the lives of people with physical disabilities, work that was informed perhaps by his own experience with polio and that represented the most socially engaged dimension of a career that was otherwise focused on beauty, celebrity, and the visual pleasures of the upper reaches of British life. He maintained his relationship with David and Sarah throughout, seeing them with a regularity that suggests genuine paternal attachment, whatever his failings as a husband. The children moved between two households now, Kensington Palace with their mother, their father's home for weekends and holidays, navigating the divided geography of a broken family with the quiet competence that children of divorce develop as a matter of survival. They carried no public grievance. They made no scenes. They had been trained by everything they had witnessed to adapt without complaint. And so they adapted. What the years immediately following the divorce revealed, with a clarity that the crisis itself had obscured, was the beginning of two very different trajectories. David and Sarah were no longer simply the children of Princess Margaret and Lord Snowden. They were becoming, slowly and deliberately, individual people. People whose choices about education, work, and identity would determine whether the family's pattern of glamour and destruction would repeat itself or whether something quieter and more durable might be constructed from the wreckage. David's path was the more visible of the two, though visibility was not what he sought. After Bedales, where the progressive, arts-focused environment had given him the space to discover his affinity for craft and design, he went to Parnham House in Dorset, the John Makepeace School for Craftsmen in Wood. That choice deserves attention, because it was not the choice the palace would have expected and not the choice most young men in his position would have made. He was a viscount, the son of a princess, and an earl, the nephew of the queen. The conventional path would have led to a commission in the Guards, a position in the city, or at the very least a degree from Oxford or Cambridge that would have slotted him neatly into the upper reaches of the British establishment. Instead, he chose to learn how to make furniture. He chose wood, tools, joints, the physical discipline of working with his hands to create objects that were useful and beautiful and that existed entirely outside the world of titles, cameras, and palace protocol. There is something about that choice that is worth sitting with, because it reveals the architecture of David's response to his childhood. He did not rebel. He did not reject his family or his position. He did not seek out scandal or make dramatic public gestures of dissent. He simply turned toward something real. Wood does not lie. A dovetailed joint either fits or it does not. A piece of furniture either stands on its own or it falls over. After a childhood spent inside a family where the gap between appearance and reality had been the central, defining, devastating fact, David chose a vocation in which the gap did not exist, in which the thing you made was the thing you were. The craftsmanship was not a rejection of his inheritance. It was a translation of it. He took the aesthetic sensibility he had absorbed from both parents, Margaret's love of beauty, Snowden's understanding of form and composition, and channeled it into something material, solid, and immune to the kind of betrayal that had destroyed the marriage. He completed his training at Parnham under Makepeace's tutelage, learning not merely technique but a philosophy of craft that treated the making of furniture as an art form rather than a trade. And in 1985, at the age of 23, he founded his own company, Linley. The choice of name was deliberate. Viscount Linley was his courtesy title, the name by which the public knew him, and by attaching it to a furniture business rather than a social column or a charitable foundation, David was making a statement that was as clear as any public declaration he would ever make. The title was now attached to something he had made with his own hands and his own decisions. The business began modestly. A workshop, a small team, bespoke commissions from clients who valued fine craftsmanship and were willing to pay for it. But it grew steadily through the late 1980s as David's reputation as a designer and maker established itself on its own terms. He designed everything from dining tables to jewelry boxes, and the work attracted attention not because it came from a viscount, but because it was genuinely good. Reviewers noted the precision, the attention to material, the sense that every piece had been thought through by someone who understood both the functional requirements of the object and the aesthetic possibilities of the wood from which it was made. By the early 1990s, Linley had become a recognized name in the British design world, with a shop in Pimlico Road and a client list that included some of the most discerning collectors in the country. David was doing what he had set out to do, building an identity that was his own, grounded in skill rather than birth, respected for what it produced rather than for the name on the letterhead. He would later take on additional roles. An appointment at Christie's as honorary chairman for Europe, the Middle East, Russia, and India reflected his growing stature in the broader world of art and luxury. But the foundation was always the craft, the wood, the tools, the joint that either held or did not. In a family where appearances had been weaponized and images had been the medium of both creation and destruction, David chose to work in a medium that could not deceive. Sarah's trajectory was quieter and in many ways more difficult to trace because she pursued a kind of life that was specifically designed not to be traced. After school, she studied at the Camberwell School of Arts and Crafts and later at the Royal Academy Schools, developing as a painter with a seriousness and a discipline that had nothing to do with her family name. She exhibited her work as Sarah Armstrong-Jones, using her birth name rather than any title. At galleries, including the Redfern Gallery in London, where she showed landscapes and portraits that reflected a sensibility shaped by close observation and a preference for the private over the spectacular. Her paintings were not the work of a royal dilettante. They were careful, considered, technically accomplished, and grounded in the kind of sustained looking that she had been practicing since childhood, when watching had been both a temperamental inclination and a survival strategy. But Sarah's path also took her further from the palace orbit than David's ever did, and the journey that carried her away began improbably with a trip alongside the father whose absences had defined so much of her childhood. In the mid-1980s, Snowden was working on a photographic project in India, part of his ongoing interest in documentary photography and in cultures beyond the insular world of the British establishment. And Sarah accompanied him. The trip was significant for reasons that went beyond the father-daughter relationship, and important though that was. India offered Sarah something she had never experienced: a visual world of overwhelming scale, color, and spiritual depth, a landscape that made the careful compositions of her English painting training feel small and contained. The temples, the textiles, the quality of light at dawn and dusk, the faces of people living lives that bore no resemblance to anything she had known in Kensington or at Sandringham. All of it fed her artistic sensibility in ways that would sustain her work for years to come. It was in India, or in the artistic circles connected to her father's work there, that Sarah met Daniel Chatto. He was an actor. He had appeared in the Merchant Ivory film Heat and Dust, the kind of tasteful literary production that occupied the intersection of British art house cinema and international festival culture. He was the son of the actor Tom Chatto and Rosalind Chatto, who would later become a publisher and editor. Daniel was emphatically not from the royal world. He was not from the aristocratic world. He was from the world of independent film, theater, and the arts, a world that overlapped with the palace orbit at certain cocktail parties and exhibition openings, but that operated by entirely different principles. He was, by every account, a kind and unshowy man, interested in art and in Sarah's art, with none of the competitive edge or compulsive restlessness that had characterized her father. The Sarah and Daniel relationship matters because it provides the documentary's clearest evidence that the family pattern could be broken, not through dramatic rupture or public rebellion, but through the quietest possible form of choice. Sarah did not need to reject her family to build a different kind of life. She needed only to choose a partner who wanted the same thing she did: privacy, creative work, children raised away from the glare, and a marriage that did not depend on spectacle or status for its meaning. They would marry on the 14th of July, 1994, at St. Stephen Walbrook in the city of London. A Christopher Wren church, beautiful but not grand in the way Westminster Abbey was grand, in a ceremony that was small by royal standards. The Queen attended. The family was present, but the event did not aspire to the national significance that Margaret's wedding had carried in 1960. The modesty was deliberate, and it was the point. Sarah had watched from the inside what happened to a marriage that began as a public fairy tale. She chose something that began as a private commitment. She chose something that might last. They would have 2 sons. Samuel, born in 1996, and Arthur, born in 1999. Children who would grow up in a household defined by art, quiet routine, and a fierce protection of family privacy that bore the unmistakable imprint of their mother's experience. But while the children were building their separate adult lives, their mother's world was contracting. And it is here in the 1980s and 90s that the documentary must track Margaret's decline with the specificity and restraint that the subject demands, not as a tabloid narrative of self destruction, but as the documented medical reality of a woman whose body was absorbing the accumulated cost of decades of smoking, drinking, and the particular kind of stress that comes from living an intensely public life without the emotional resources to sustain it. The timeline is clinical and relentless. In 1985, Margaret underwent surgery to remove part of her left lung, the consequence of years of heavy smoking that had begun in her 20s, when cigarettes were as much a part of the social uniform as cocktails and evening dress, and that had continued long after the medical evidence made their cost unmistakable. She was 54 years old. A partial pneumonectomy is not a minor procedure. It requires general anesthesia, the opening of the chest cavity, the removal of damaged tissue, and a recovery period that can stretch for months. Margaret's recovery was slow enough to curtail her public engagement significantly, and the surgery left her with reduced lung capacity that would compound every subsequent respiratory illness she faced. David was 23, newly established in his furniture workshop, building Linley from the ground up. Sarah was 21, immersed in her art training at Camberwell. Both visited, both were present, both understood. With the particular clarity that comes from watching a parent undergo major surgery, that their mother's health was no longer a matter of tabloid speculation or social gossip. It was now a matter of hospital wards, surgical teams, and the growing awareness that the body, which had once been the most photographed in the royal family, was being systematically diminished by the accumulated cost of the choices their mother had made, and by the circumstances, the loneliness and the institutional pressure and the thwarted desire that had driven her to make them. The years that followed the lung surgery brought a period of relative stability. Margaret continued her public duties, attended events, maintained her social life at a reduced tempo. But the underlying trajectory was clear. Her stamina was less, her breathing was more labored. The cigarettes, astonishingly, continued as though the surgery had been a tax paid to the future rather than a warning received from it. And then, in 1993, came pneumonia, a word that in medical terms describes an infection of the lungs, but that in biographical terms marked another downward step in a decline that was becoming impossible to ignore. The pneumonia required hospitalization, antibiotics, and a recovery that left Margaret visibly frailer than she had been before. She was 62 years old. She had lost part of a lung. She was still smoking. She was still drinking, though by most accounts, the quantities had diminished from their peak in the years immediately following the divorce. And the children, now adults in their late 20s and early 30s, building lives, establishing careers, preparing to start families of their own, were learning the particular burden of loving a parent whose self-destruction is documented, discussed, and photographed by a national press that has long since lost any sympathy for the person at its center. Meanwhile, there was a moment in 1981 that the documentary should render with care because it captures something essential about the position Sarah occupied within the royal family. On the 29th of July, 1981, the Prince of Wales married Lady Diana Spencer at St. Paul's Cathedral, and Sarah Armstrong-Jones, then 17 years old, served as one of the bridesmaids. The wedding was watched by an estimated 750 million people worldwide, the largest television audience for any event in history at that point. And the images of the bridal party are among the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century. Sarah is there in the photographs, poised and composed, a young woman performing ceremonial duty with the calm that her upbringing had trained into her. But what the photographs cannot show is the private context. This was a girl who had watched her own parents' televised fairy tale marriage collapse into tabloid humiliation, standing inside another televised fairy tale marriage that would, within a decade, collapse even more spectacularly. The irony was not available to anyone at the time. It is available now, and the documentary should use it. Not with heavy irony, but with the quiet observation that the royal family's capacity for staging public romance remained undiminished, even as the private evidence for its sustainability continued to erode. David's marriage to Serena Stanhope in October 1993 appeared from the outside to offer a different kind of restoration. Serena was the daughter of Viscount Petersham, later the 11th Earl of Harrington, An aristocratic family with estates in Derbyshire and a position in the social world that was old enough to take for granted and well connected enough to maintain without effort. She was beautiful, poised, and comfortable in the world David had been born into. The world of country houses and London clubs and seasonal rituals that formed the social infrastructure of the British upper classes. The marriage seemed to promise what Margaret and Snowden's union had so spectacularly failed to deliver: a partnership that was well matched in background, temperament, and expectation, grounded not in the volatile alchemy of royal glamour and bohemian artistry, but in the steadier foundations of shared class, shared manners, and a shared understanding of what a life at the intersection of the aristocracy and the design world required. The wedding took place at the Church of St. Margaret, Westminster, a church attached to Westminster Abbey but smaller, more intimate, a choice that carried historical resonance without demanding the full-scale pageantry of a state occasion. It was, in its quiet way, another response to the family history. David had watched what a wedding as national spectacle had done to his parents' marriage. He chose something more contained. They would have two children: Charles Armstrong-Jones, born in 1999, styled Viscount Linley as David's heir, and Margarita Armstrong-Jones, born in 2002 and named, with a tenderness the family rarely displayed in public, for the grandmother whose death would come just weeks before Margarita's arrival. The family unit looked stable. The lineage was continuing. The Snowden name was being carried forward into a new generation, but stability in this family had a way of proving temporary. That the Snowden marriage to Serena would eventually end in separation, announced publicly in 2020, belongs to a later part of the story. In the 1990s, the marriage was new, the children had not yet been born, and the surface was calm. What mattered for the documentary's timeline was the contrast between the two siblings' choices in that decade. David choosing a conventional aristocratic marriage that echoed in its structure, if not its dynamics, the world his parents had inhabited. Sarah choosing a quieter, less conventional path with a man from outside the establishment entirely. Both choices were forms of response to the same childhood. Both were attempts to answer the question that their parents' marriage had posed without ever explicitly asking, is it possible to build a family life that does not destroy the people inside it? By the late 1990s, both David and Sarah had constructed adult identities that seemed, to the outside observer, like successful escapes from the wreckage of their childhood. David was a respected designer and businessman, his Linley brand firmly established, his marriage to Serena apparently solid, his position in the wider royal family secure without being burdensome. He attended family events, fulfilled the minimal public obligations expected of someone in his position, and otherwise got on with the business of making furniture and running a company. He had inherited his father's title without inheriting his father's restlessness, or so it appeared. Sarah was a working painter with a serious exhibition record, married to a good and unshowy man, raising two small sons in a household defined by art, quiet routine, and a fierce protection of family privacy that bore the unmistakable stamp of her mother's example. Not the example Margaret had intended to set, but the one Sarah had absorbed nonetheless. She remained connected to the royal family, attending events and maintaining relationships with her cousins, but she did so on her own terms and at her own pace, never allowing the connection to become the defining feature of her public identity. Both children had done what the children of damaged, famous families sometimes manage to do when they are intelligent enough and disciplined enough and lucky enough. They had taken the raw material of their inheritance, not the money, which was modest by royal standards, but the patterns, the knowledge, the aesthetic sensibility, the emotional scars, and transformed it into something that functioned, something that held, something that was theirs. But their mother was still alive, and her body was still failing, and the escape they had built for themselves was about to be interrupted by the one thing that no amount of craft or privacy or careful life construction could protect them from. On the 23rd of February, 1998, while on holiday in Mustique, that island again, always that island, the place that kept returning to the story like a recurring dream that will not resolve itself, Margaret suffered a stroke. She was 67 years old. She was found in her bathroom at Les Jolies-Eaux, the house her uncle had designed for warmth and light and freedom, and the stroke affected her left side, her mobility, and her vision, leaving her with lasting physical impairment that would make the remaining years of her life progressively more difficult and more dependent on the care of others. The stroke was not entirely unexpected. Her smoking, her drinking, the accumulated stress of decades lived at the pitch she had maintained, but the location gave it a particular cruelty. Mustique had been the place of escape. It had been the place where, in the early years, the family had been closest to something resembling ordinary happiness. It had been the place where the Llewellyn photographs had destroyed the marriage's public reputation. And now it was the place where Margaret's body had begun its final betrayal. There was a second stroke in 1998, then further strokes in the following years, each one diminishing her further. Her sight deteriorated badly. She suffered burns to her feet from a scalding bath, incident that spoke to the vulnerability of her reduced mobility, and her world contracted from the wide social orbit of her younger years into the smaller compass of Kensington Palace, medical appointments, and the company of those closest to her. David and Sarah were no longer watching from a distance. They were being pulled back, and not dramatically, not in a single crisis, but gradually, visit by visit, telephone call by telephone call, into the intimate proximity with their mother's decline that they had spent their adult lives learning to live alongside, but never fully escaping. David was in his late 30s, running Lindley, married to Serena, building a life that looked settled and productive. Sarah was in her early 30s, married to Daniel, painting, raising her sons, living the quiet life she had chosen. Both had done what the children of damaged families hoped to do. They had constructed identities that were their own, not merely reflections of the damage that had formed them. But Margaret was their mother. Her body was failing, and the long final chapter of her life was beginning. A chapter in which the children who had learned to survive by maintaining distance would be required, by love and by duty and by the simple biological fact of being a children, to come close again. The escape had been real. It had also been temporary. And what was approaching now, the gathering deterioration, the hospital visits, the strokes that would continue to come, the final night at Kensington Palace when the ambulance would arrive, would demand of David and Sarah something different from the composure and discretion that had carried them through adolescence and into adulthood. It would demand presence. It would demand proximity to suffering. It would demand the willingness to sit through the small hours of the morning with the woman whose beauty and appetites and contradictions had shaped every corner of their lives, and to watch as the last of what she had been was taken from her. They had spent decades building lives designed to avoid repeating their mother's story. They were about to discover that the story was not finished with them. The stroke on Mustique in February 1998 was not, in the medical sense, catastrophic. Margaret survived it. She was flown back to London, treated at King Edward VII Hospital, the private hospital in Marylebone that had served the royal family for decades, its discretion as impeccable as its clinical reputation, and she recovered enough to return to Kensington Palace and eventually to a version of her former life. But the version was diminished, and everyone who saw her knew it. The stroke had affected her left side, leaving her with reduced mobility and impaired coordination. Her vision deteriorated. She would later be described as partially sighted, struggling with the everyday task that her staff had always assisted with, but that now required a different, more intimate kind of help. The woman who had once commanded a dinner table with her wit and her beauty was now navigating rooms with the careful, deliberate movement of someone whose body had become unfamiliar territory. A second stroke followed later in 1998, compounding the damage from the first. And then, in the years that followed, more strokes came. Smaller episodes, some barely noted in the medical record, each one removing another layer of the physical capability that Margaret had once taken for granted. The cumulative effect was devastating in its specificity. She lost the ability to walk unaided. She required assistance with bathing, with dressing, with the ordinary mechanics of daily life that most people perform without thought. Her feet were badly burned in a scalding bath incident, the details of which were reported with varying degrees of accuracy, but which spoke unmistakably to the vulnerability of a woman whose mobility and sensation had been compromised by repeated neurological damage. The burns required treatment. They caused pain. They limited her movement further, and they became, for those close to her, a symbol of the cruel reduction that illness imposes on a person who has lived for decades at the center of the most image-conscious institution in Britain. The body that had been photographed in ball gowns and bathing costumes, that had danced and swum and presided over state occasions, with the physical confidence of someone who knew she was beautiful, was now a source of daily difficulty and dependency. David and Sarah watched this happen. That sentence is simple, but the reality it describes was not. Watching a parent deteriorate is one of the most common human experiences, and it is also one of the most isolating, because no amount of shared experience can prepare you for the specific texture of your own mother's decline. The particular way her voice changes, the particular expression on her face when she cannot do something she could do last month, the particular quality of the silence in a room where someone you love is becoming someone you are losing. For David, the watching took place alongside the demands of a working life that required his creative energy and his physical presence. Linley was established and successful, but furniture design is not the kind of business that runs itself. He had commissions to fulfill, clients to meet, a workshop to oversee, a brand to maintain. He had Serena and the children. Charles was a toddler, Margarita not yet born. And the responsibilities of fatherhood pressed against the responsibilities of sonship in ways that created a daily calculus of presence and absence that anyone who has cared for an aging parent while raising young children will recognize. You cannot be in two places. You choose and you live with the guilt of the place you are not. For Sarah, the watching was perhaps more continuous, more attuned to the daily shifts in Margaret's condition. Sarah had always been the more observant of the two siblings, the one whose attention to nuance and capacity for quiet presence made her a natural companion in illness. She lived in London, close enough to Kensington for regular visits, and her working life as a painter, solitary, self-directed, conducted in the privacy of a studio rather than the public arena of a business, gave her a flexibility that David's did not. She could arrange her days around visits to her mother. She could sit with Margaret in the afternoons in the rooms at Kensington that were increasingly configured for medical care rather than social life, and she could be present in the way that presence sometimes matters more than any specific action or conversation. Simply there, a familiar face, a steady voice, a hand within reach. Both children maintained the telephone contact that becomes, for adult children of ailing parents, a lifeline and a burden in equal measure. The calls that you make because you must, because you love her, because you need to know she is still there, and that you sometimes dread because each one might bring the news you are not ready to hear. Both carried the knowledge that the woman at the center of their lives was moving, with a slowness that was itself a particular form of cruelty, toward an ending that no amount of medical intervention or filial devotion could prevent. Margaret's world contracted through 1999, 2000, and 2001 in ways that were both visible and invisible. Her public engagements, which had already been reduced by the first stroke, became rarer and more carefully managed. When she did appear, either at a family gathering, at an event that her sense of duty or her residual social appetite compelled her to attend, the effort required was enormous, and the result was sometimes painful to witness. She was wheeled into rooms she had once entered on her own feet. She squinted at faces she had once recognized at a distance. She spoke with a care and a deliberation that suggested each sentence required more energy than it once had. The wit was still there, by some accounts. She could still deliver a remark that cut or charmed, depending on the target. But the delivery was slower, the timing altered by the neurological damage that had rewired her capacity for the quick, sharp social performance that had once been her signature. At Kensington Palace, the household adjusted to the new reality with the practiced efficiency of a royal staff that had been managing illness and decline for centuries. Margaret's apartment, the same rooms where she had hosted dinner parties and entertained artists and argued with Snowden and raised her children, became increasingly a medical facility. Nurses attended her. Equipment appeared. The rhythms of the household shifted from social to clinical, from the management of a princess's public calendar to the management of a patient's physical needs. The staff who had known her in her prime, who had served drinks at her parties, arranged flowers for her dinners, answered the telephone when Snowden called to say he would not be home, now helped her out of bed in the morning and ensured she was comfortable at night. The intimacy of that transition, from employer to patient, from the most glamorous woman in the room to the most vulnerable, was something the documentary should acknowledge without sentimentalizing. It was not dignified. It was not comfortable. It was the reality of a human body in its final years, attended to by people who remembered what it had once been and who treated it, by all accounts, with the gentleness it deserved. The Queen visited. The Queen Mother, herself in her final years, she was 101 years old in 2001, frail but indomitable, the family's last living link to the pre-war era, was kept informed. The wider family maintained the attentive distance that the Windsors had always practiced when one of their number was seriously ill. Present, but not intrusive, concerned, but not demonstrative, the emotional code operating even now, even at the end, even when the person at its center was too diminished to perform the composure that the code demanded. Through it all, David and Sarah held their positions. They visited. They sat with their mother. They managed the competing demands of their own lives and the gravitational pull of Kensington Palace, where the woman who had shaped every dimension of their existence was slowly, irreversibly, becoming someone they could not save. The last months were the hardest, in the way that the last months of any prolonged illness are the hardest. Not because any single day is dramatically terrible, but because the accumulation of small losses creates a weight that presses on everyone who is close enough to feel it. By the autumn of 2001, Margaret's world had narrowed to the dimensions of her apartment at Kensington Palace. She rarely went out. Her public engagements had effectively ceased. The diary that had once been filled with ballet galas, charity evenings, and the social obligations of a senior member of the royal family was now empty of everything except medical appointments and the visits of family and close friends. By early 2002, the contraction was nearly complete. Margaret was largely confined to Kensington Palace, and within it, to the rooms that had been adapted for her care. Her vision was severely impaired. She could make out shapes and light, but not the detail of the faces around her. A loss that was particularly cruel for a woman who had lived her life in a world organized around looking and being looked at. Her mobility was minimal. She relied on a wheelchair, on the strength of the nurses and carers who moved her from bed to chair and back again, on the daily routines of medication, meals, and the small comforts that become the architecture of a life reduced to its most basic functions. She was 71 years old, though illness and the accumulated damage of decades had aged her far beyond her years. The face that had once launched 1,000 magazine covers was drawn, altered, marked by the strokes that had remapped its contours. The body that had once been dressed by Norman Hartnell and photographed by Cecil Beaton and her own husband was now dressed by the nurses who helped her in and out of bed each morning and each night. The household staff at Kensington, some of whom had served Margaret for years, who had witnessed the trajectory from glamour to decline at closer range than anyone except the family, continued their work with the particular combination of professionalism and tenderness that characterize good care in impossible circumstances. They knew what she had been. They saw what she was. They bridged the gap with routine, with courtesy, and with a respect for the person inside the diminished body that the tabloid coverage of Margaret's decline had long since ceased to provide. The Queen visited her sister at Kensington when her own schedule permitted. The visits were private, undocumented in any public record, but their occurrence is confirmed by sources close to both households. What the two sisters said to each other in those final visits? The sister who had carried the crown for 50 years and the sister who had carried everything the crown had cost belongs to the realm of speculation that the documentary should not enter. What can be said is that the bond between them had survived the Townsend affair, the Snowden scandal, the tabloid humiliation, and the decades of diverging trajectories that had made their lives look from the outside like studies in contrast. Elizabeth was the duty, Margaret was the desire, and now Margaret was dying, and the contrast no longer mattered. The Queen Mother, herself, 101 years old and in failing health at Royal Lodge, was kept informed of Margaret's condition. The matriarch who had taught both daughters the code of charm and silence, who had presided over family gatherings with a warmth that never quite disguised the steel underneath, was approaching her own end. The family was losing its oldest generation in real time, and the children and grandchildren who remained could feel the ground shifting beneath them. The people who had defined the family's character, who had set the emotional weather for decades, were leaving one by one, and nothing that replaced them would carry quite the same weight. The final crisis began on the 8th of February, 2002, a Friday. Margaret was at Kensington Palace. The details of the day itself are not publicly documented with the specificity the documentary would ideally want. There is no minute-by-minute account of what she ate, what she said, how she spent the afternoon, but the official record provides the clinical sequence that matters. She suffered another stroke. The stroke triggered cardiac complications, and at some point during the evening or the early hours of the night, the situation deteriorated to the point where the decision was made to move her from the palace to the hospital. The ambulance arrived at Kensington Palace in the early hours of Saturday, the 9th of February. The transfer to King Edward VII Hospital took place at approximately 2:30 in the morning, a detail the palace would later confirm and that fixes the moment with the precision the documentary requires. This is the scene the entire narrative has been building toward, not because the medical details are inherently dramatic, but because of who was present. David was there, Sarah was there. Lord Linley and Lady Sarah Chatto The formal names the palace statement would use, the names that reduced two grieving children to their institutional identities, were with their mother when she was taken from the palace where she had lived for more than 4 decades and driven through the empty London streets to the hospital where she would die. The telephone calls would have come in the middle of the night, the calls that every child of a seriously ill parent dreads, the ones that come at the hour when the telephone's ring carries a particular weight because nobody calls at 2 in the morning with good news. David would have been woken at his home, Sarah at hers. They would have dressed in the dark or in the half-light of a bedroom disrupted by emergency, and they would have made their way to Kensington Palace or directly to the hospital. The road familiar from years of visits, the streets foreign in their emptiness at that hour. There is a quality to London at 2:30 on a winter morning that the documentary should evoke. The city is not asleep so much as suspended. The streetlights casting their orange glow on pavements where nobody walks, the buildings dark, the parks locked and silent. The ambulance would have moved through this suspended city carrying their mother, and David and Sarah would have followed, by car, most likely, through the same dark streets, past the same sleeping houses, toward the hospital in Marylebone, where Margaret had been treated after every previous crisis, where the staff knew her name and her history and the particular architecture of her decline. The drive from Kensington Palace to King Edward VII Hospital takes perhaps 15 minutes at that hour, perhaps less with the roads clear. 15 minutes through a city that had once been Margaret's stage, the city that had watched her wedding procession in 1960, that had displayed her photograph on every newspaper front in 1976, that had documented her strokes and her burns in her wheelchair with the remorseless attention of a press that had long since decided her story was public property. And now the city was dark and still, and the ambulance moved through it without ceremony, and inside the vehicle was a 71-year-old woman who had been a princess since birth and whose 2 children were following her to the place where she would stop being anything at all. At the hospital, Margaret was treated. The cardiac complications were addressed by the medical team with whatever interventions the situation demanded. The specifics are not part of the public record, and the documentary should respect that boundary. What is known is that the situation was serious. What is known is that David and Sarah were there in the hospital through the hours that followed. The hours between 2:30 and the end, the hours when the corridors are quiet and the lighting is low and the only sounds are the machines and the footsteps of nurses and the particular quality of silence that fills a hospital room where someone is dying. What David and Sarah said to each other during those hours, what they said to their mother, whether Margaret was conscious enough to recognize their voices or feel their presence, whether she knew she was dying or whether the strokes had carried her past the point of knowing. None of this is publicly documented, and the documentary must not invent what it cannot verify. What is known is this: they were with her. The palace statement would confirm it in language that was characteristically restrained and that carried beneath its formal composure the weight of something far more human than institutional prose could convey. Lord Linleigh and Lady Sarah Chatto were with Princess Margaret. They were with her. After a lifetime of adapting to their mother's contradictions, the glamour and the drinking, the wit and the cruelty, the love and the damage, the beauty that filled every room and the neediness that emptied it, they were with her at the end. After decades of learning to survive inside the gap between the public myth of Princess Margaret and the private reality of their mother, after building adult lives that were carefully, deliberately designed to create distance from the turbulence that had shaped them, they were with her. At 6:30 in the morning, in a hospital room in Marylebone, with the winter light just beginning to gray the windows, all of the distance collapsed. There was no gap anymore between public and private, between myth and reality, between the princess the nation had watched and the mother the children had known. There was only a woman who had stopped breathing, and the son and the daughter who had been present when she did. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowden, died at King Edward VII Hospital at 6:30 in the morning on Saturday, the 9th of February 2002. She was 71 years old. She had been a princess for her entire life. From the moment of her birth at Glamis Castle to the moment of her death in a London hospital, the title had been the inescapable frame around every experience she had ever had. She had been a wife for 18 years. She had been a mother for 40. She had been famous, admired, envied, pitied, judged, and ultimately diminished by the combined forces of her own appetites and the institution that had simultaneously elevated and constrained her. She had loved Peter Townsend and been told she could not have him. She had married Anthony Armstrong-Jones and watched the marriage corrode from the inside. She had drunk too much, smoked too much, stayed up too late, demanded too much from the people around her, and paid the physical price across 2 decades of illness that left her blind, immobilized, and dependent. And at the end, the only people who mattered were the two who had been there from the beginning. The son born at Clarence House in 1961 and the daughter born at Kensington Palace in 1964, who had grown up inside the wreckage of her marriage, absorbed the damage of her choices, and been present at her bedside when the last of what she had been was taken from her. There is a beat of stillness after a death that the documentary must honor. Before the telephone calls resume, before the palace machinery engages, before the press releases are drafted and the flags are lowered and the nation is informed, there is a moment when the room contains only the fact of what has happened. A mother has died. 2 children are in the room. The morning light is strengthening outside the hospital windows. And the story that began with a televised wedding in 1960 and passed through scandal, divorce, illness, and decades of quiet adaptation has arrived at its simplest, most irreducible conclusion. The death was announced by Buckingham Palace later that Saturday morning. The statement was brief, formal, and final, crafted in the institutional language that the monarchy had perfected across centuries of managing public grief. It confirmed the time, the place, the presence of the children, and the cause. A cardiac event following the stroke that had precipitated the overnight crisis. The press, which had spent decades documenting Margaret's life in every register from adulation to contempt, responded with the particular mixture of reverence and retrospection that British newspapers produce when a royal figure dies. The front pages carried photographs from across her life: the young princess at her sister's coronation, the bride at Westminster Abbey, the woman in the bathing costume on Mustique, the wheelchair-bound figure of her final years, and the editorial assessments tended to follow a familiar pattern: the Townsend sacrifice, the Snowden glamour, the Llewellyn scandal, the long decline. What the press coverage largely missed, and what this documentary exists to address, was the story as seen from the other side of the room, the children's side, the side where the headlines were not stories but lived experience, where the photographs were not images but moments stolen from a private life, and where the death of a princess was, before it was anything else, the death of a mother. The Queen was at Sandringham when the news reached her. She had lost her sister, the sister she had shared a nursery with at 145 Piccadilly, the sister who had been her closest companion through the upheavals of abdication and war, the sister whose life had taken a path so different from her own that the contrast sometimes obscured the bond beneath it. Whatever Elizabeth felt, she processed it in the way she had processed every personal blow across half a century of public duty, privately, silently, within the code that permitted grief but never its public display. The Queen Mother, 101 years old and in the final weeks of her own life at Royal Lodge, was informed of her younger daughter's death. The loss of a child, and even an adult child, even a child of 71, is a wound that no parent's age can soften. The Queen Mother had 7 weeks left to live. It was, in its way, a final enactment of the pattern that had defined Margaret's life within the monarchy. She was royal enough for the death to be news, royal enough for the nation to pause and acknowledge the loss, but not central enough for the nation to stop. Despair, even in death, occupied the secondary position. David and Sarah attended the funeral. David, now 40 years old, carried himself with the composed stillness that he had been practicing since the age of 14, when the Mustique photographs had taught him that the only safe response to a public family crisis was the absence of visible emotion. Sarah, 37, was the same. Present, contained, her grief invisible behind the composure that the family code demanded and that she had learned, in childhood, to deploy as naturally as breathing. They walked into St. George's Chapel in the castle where their mother had spent weekends as a girl, where the weight of Windsor history pressed down from every stone and every banner and every memorial to the kings and queens who had come before, and they committed the woman who had given them life and damage in approximately equal measure to the care of whatever lay beyond the chapel walls. The funeral was attended by the Queen, by the Duke of Edinburgh, by the Prince of Wales, and by the wider royal family. The extended clan that Margaret had been part of since birth, and that had, at various points, celebrated her, constrained her, judged her, and loved her in the particular way that very old families love their most difficult members, with a mixture of exasperation, loyalty, and the unspoken understanding that the family's survival depends on absorbing its losses without breaking apart. Snowden, Margaret's former husband, was not at the ceremony. Their divorce had placed him outside the inner circle of mourning, and his absence was noted but not apparently contested. He was 82 years old at the time, and still alive, still working, still the photographer who had once created the images of the woman the nation was now burying. Margaret's body was cremated, and her ashes were placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor Castle, alongside the remains of her father, the king who had never expected to reign, the man whose accession had set in motion the chain of consequence that had shaped Margaret's entire life. It was a final institutional gesture, the palace claiming its own, returning the spare princess to the family vault, placing her beside the father she had adored and underneath the institution she had fought. For David and Sarah, the placement meant that their mother would rest forever inside the walls of the system that had simultaneously elevated and diminished her. Whether that was a comfort or a final irony depended entirely on how you chose to read the family's relationship with its own history. And then the cameras turned away, the press moved on to the next story. The public mourning subsided into the ordinary rhythms of national life, and David Armstrong-Jones and Sarah Chatto were left, as bereaved children always are, with the question that the death of a parent poses but never answers. Now what? Margaret's death had ended one chapter, the chapter in which she was the central figure, the gravitational force around which the children's lives had orbited, whether they sought her out or kept their distance. But it had not ended the inheritance. It had not dissolved the patterns. It had not released David and Sarah from the particular challenge of being the children of Princess Margaret, a challenge that would continue, in different forms, for the rest of their lives. The question now was not whether the damage would follow them. The damage was already there, woven into the structure of their characters, their choices, their marriages, their relationship to the institution that had shaped their mother and shaped them. The question was what they would do with it. Whether the pattern would repeat, whether it would transform, or whether it would simply continue more quietly in lives that had been designed, from their earliest conscious decisions, to contain it. That question is the documentary's final act, and the answer, when it comes, is not dramatic. It is not redemptive. It is just a life, two lives, lived in the aftermath of everything that came before. The cameras moved on, the press moved on. The public mourning, such as it was, subsided into the ordinary currents of national life, and within weeks the nation's attention had shifted to the Queen Mother's death on the 30th of March, 7 weeks after Margaret, a loss that struck the family with a swiftness that felt almost retributive, as though the older generation was being removed all at once, leaving the survivors to navigate a landscape suddenly emptied of the people who had defined its shape. The Queen Mother's funeral, on the 9th of April, 2002, was a full state ceremonial occasion, watched by millions, covered on every channel, a public farewell of a kind that Margaret's private service at St. George's Chapel had not been. David attended, and in a gesture that carried more weight than any public statement, he took part in the Vigil of the Princes, standing guard over his grandmother's coffin as it lay in state at Westminster Hall, alongside his cousins, the Prince of Wales, the Duke of York, and the Earl of Wessex. It was a remarkable moment. The grandson who had spent his entire life avoiding the public gaze, who had built his identity around craft and discretion rather than ceremonial visibility, standing in the most visible possible position beside the coffin of the matriarch, who had taught the family the code of charm and silence that had governed everything. He stood, he was still, he endured. It was what the family required. Margaret's story, which had occupied the British imagination for more than half a century, was folded into the historical record, a cautionary tale, a glamorous tragedy, a footnote in the longer narrative of the crown. But for David and Sarah, the death of their mother did not fold neatly into anything. It was not a footnote. It was not a conclusion. It was the event after which everything else in their lives would be measured. And the question it posed, what do you do with the inheritance that is not money, did not come with an answer attached. The answer would have to be built, year by year, choice by choice, in the slow, undramatic work of living after loss. The immediate aftermath brought practical demands that cut through grief with their own relentless logic. Margaret's estate required attention. the legal and financial machinery of death that operates regardless of titles or family feeling. Her apartment at Kensington Palace, which had been her home for more than 4 decades, would be reassigned by the Crown. Her belongings were sorted, catalogued, and in some cases sold. A Christie's auction of Margaret's personal effects in June 2006, 4 years after her death, raised more than £13 million, a figure that reflected both the commercial value of royal provenance and the enduring public fascination with the woman who had owned the objects. David, with his professional connection to Christie's and his understanding of the art and antiques world, was closely involved in the process. It was, in a sense, a final act of translation, taking the material remnants of his mother's life and converting them into something that could be distributed, valued, and moved on from. The Baltimore tiara, which Margaret had worn at her wedding in 1960, sold for nearly £930,000. It was bought by a private collector. The fairy tale object had found its final owner, and the fairy tale was over. Snowden, Margaret's former husband, survived her by 15 years. He continued to work as a photographer well into his 80s. His reputation secure, his body of work respected by institutions that would preserve it long after the tabloid narratives faded, his social life active as his declining health permitted. He and Margaret had not been close in the decades before her death. The divorce had been finalized in 1978, a quarter of a century earlier, and while they had maintained a civil enough relationship for the sake of their children, the warmth that had once existed between them had been consumed by the marriage's destruction. Snowden's second marriage, to Lucy Lindsay Hogg, had also ended in divorce in 2000, and the later years of his life were marked by a revelation that added yet another layer to the family's already labyrinthine emotional architecture. In 2004, it became public knowledge that Snowden had fathered a son, Jasper Cable Alexander, born in 1998, the same year as Margaret's first stroke on Mustique. The child was the result of a relationship with the journalist Melanie Cable Alexander, and his existence had been kept secret for years. The news meant that David and Sarah had a half-brother they had not known about, born when David was 36 and Sarah was 34, conceived while their mother was still alive and declining at Kensington Palace. It was, in miniature, a repetition of the pattern that had defined Snowden's entire adult life. The parallel relationship, the secret child, the private reality concealed behind a public image of distinguished respectability. David and Sarah already had a half-sister, Lady Frances Armstrong-Jones, from Snowden's marriage to Lucy Lindsay Hogg. Now there was Jasper as well. The family tree kept branching in directions that nobody had planned, and everybody had to accommodate. They absorbed this revelation as they had absorbed every other complication their parents had produced. Quietly, without public comment, with the composure that had become not merely their defining characteristic, but their primary means of self-preservation. The pattern held, the silence held. The children of the Snowden marriage continued, as they had always done, to manage the consequences of adult choices they had never been consulted about. Snowden died on the 13th of January 2017 at his home in Kensington. He was 86 years old. His death closed a chapter that had begun with a camera and a princess in the late 1950s, and that had, across more than half a century, produced a body of photographic work that would hang in national collections, a marriage that had become shorthand for royal glamour and its costs, and two children whose lives had been shaped by his restlessness as profoundly as they had been shaped by their mother's intensity. David inherited the earldom, becoming the second Earl of Snowden, a title that connected him irrevocably to the marriage he had spent his childhood surviving and his adulthood trying to transform into something more useful than damage. David's own marriage did not survive the pressures that had accumulated across decades. He and Serena announced their separation in February 2020 after 26 years of marriage. The announcement was handled with the discretion that David had practiced since boyhood. A brief statement, no elaboration, no public recrimination. The press noted the generational echo, the son of a famously failed royal marriage now experiencing his own marital breakdown. But the comparison, while unavoidable, was inexact. David and Serena's separation was not accompanied by tabloid photographs, public humiliation, or the institutional machinery of royal crisis management. It was, by every visible measure, a private matter handled privately, which was itself a measure of how far the family had come from the chaos of 1976. The echo was real. The volume was different. David had learned from his parents' catastrophe, that the way a marriage ends matters almost as much as the fact that it does. There were also quieter complications in the years following Margaret's death. David's relationship with Linley, the company he had founded and built from a workshop into a recognized brand, became strained by financial pressures. He had borrowed from the company, accumulating debts of approximately £3 million, situation that was eventually resolved by the sale of controlling shares for £4 million in 2012. The sale meant that David lost control of the company that bore his name, a loss that was both financial and symbolic. The furniture maker, who had built his identity on craft and material independence, had been forced, by the pressures of maintaining a life at the intersection of royalty and business, to relinquish the thing he had made with his own hands. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was the kind of quiet financial erosion that afflicts many small businesses, and that in David's case carried the additional weight of a man whose entire adult life had been organized around the principle that what you build yourself cannot be taken from you. Sarah's path after Margaret's death was steadier, and this steadiness was itself a form of achievement that the documentary should not understate. She continued to paint, exhibiting under the name Sarah Armstrong-Jones at the Redfern Gallery in London, producing landscapes and portraits that reflected the same qualities she had been cultivating since her student days at Camberwell and the Royal Academy schools: careful observation, technical discipline, a preference for the quiet over the spectacular, and an attention to the particularities of light and form that suggested a painter who looked long and hard before committing anything to canvas. Her work had won early recognition: the Windsor and Newton Prize in 1988, the Creswick Landscape Prize in 1990, and her continued exhibiting through the 2000s and into the 2020s confirmed that the art was not a phase or a hobby, but the central organizing principle of her adult life. She painted because painting was what she did. The consistency was its own statement. Her marriage to Daniel Chatto endured, quietly, privately, without the kind of public drama that had consumed her parents' union and that had, by a different mechanism, eventually ended her brother's. Daniel remained the kind and unshowy man he had always been, involved in the arts, supportive of Sarah's work, present for the children, and content to occupy a position in the extended royal family that was defined by loyalty rather than ambition. Their sons grew up in a household shaped by art, routine, and the particular kind of privacy that Sarah had been constructing since she was a girl, watching from the edges of her mother's chaotic social world. Samuel Chatto, the elder son, born in 1996, studied history of art at Edinburgh and became a sculptor and ceramicist based in West Sussex, a maker like his uncle David, though working in clay rather than wood, and operating at an even greater remove from the palace world that had shaped his grandparents' lives. He had also trained as a yoga teacher in India, a detail that suggested the family's connection to the subcontinent, formed during Snowden's photographic projects and Sarah's transformative visit in the 1980s, had passed to the next generation in altered form. Arthur Chatto, born in 1999, took a markedly different path: Eton, Edinburgh, and then the Royal Marines, but the family's characteristic discretion held for both brothers. Neither sought the spotlight, neither traded on the royal connection. The creative inheritance continued in Samuel, the physical discipline appeared in Arthur. Both represented departures from the family pattern of glamour, scandal, and institutional entanglement. In 2024, Sarah was named president of the Royal Ballet, president of the Royal Ballet School, and president of Birmingham Royal Ballet, a constellation of roles that carried a particular emotional resonance and that represented the most significant public position she had ever accepted. Her mother, Princess Margaret, had served as president of the Royal Ballet and the Royal Ballet School from 1956 until her death in 2002, a tenure of nearly half a century during which Margaret's love of dance had been one of the most genuine and sustained features of her public life. Margaret had attended rehearsals, known the dancers personally, understood the art form with a musical and visual intelligence that transcended ceremonial obligation. For Sarah to inherit those roles was not merely an institutional succession. It was a form of continuation, the daughter carrying forward the one part of her mother's public legacy that had been uncomplicated by scandal, untouched by tabloid exposure, and rooted in genuine artistic devotion. It was perhaps the closest Sarah could come to honoring Margaret's memory on Margaret's own terms, not through the management of a public image, not through the maintenance of appearances, but through a sustained commitment to an art form they had both loved. The inheritance that was not money had, in this instance, Produce something worth inheriting. No account of this family's afterlife would be complete without acknowledging the version of the story that the public knows best, and the version that, for all its brilliance, tells it from the wrong side of the room. The Crown, Netflix's dramatization of the reign of Elizabeth II, ran for 6 seasons from 2016 to 2023 and became the most influential portrayal of the modern monarchy since the invention of television. The series returned to Princess Margaret repeatedly across its entire span, treating her as one of the central dramatic figures of the reign. She was played by 3 actresses in succession, each capturing a different stage of the trajectory. Vanessa Kirby in the early seasons, embodying the young Margaret's beauty, wit, and the devastating Townsend sacrifice, with a precision that introduced the character to a generation who had never seen the real woman in her prime. Helena Bonham Carter in the middle season, portraying the Snowden marriage, the Mustique scandal, and the beginning of the decline, with a combination of sympathy, sharpness, and a refusal to sentimentalize. And Leslie Manville in the final seasons, inhabiting the long diminishment with a dignity and a restraint that the tabloid press had rarely afforded the real Margaret. The series was beautifully made, compulsively watchable, and enormously influential in shaping the public understanding of Margaret's life. But from the perspective of this documentary, what The Crown missed is as significant as what it captured. The show dramatized Margaret as sister, lover, rebel, and tragic royal, all of which she was. It did not and could not, given its structural focus on the sovereign, tell the story from the children's side. David and Sarah appear in this series as peripheral figures, glimpsed in domestic scenes, occasionally referenced in passing, but never given the sustained narrative attention that would reveal what their mother's life actually felt like from their position inside it. That omission is not a criticism of The Crown. It is a description of the space this documentary occupies. This is not another Princess Margaret story. This is the story of what it cost to be her children, and that story until now has not been told. David Armstrong-Jones, the second Earl of Snowden, is 64 years old. He lives between London, Gloucestershire, and Provence. A flat in Chelsea, a cottage on the Dalesford estate, and the Château d'Auteuil in the Luberon. The geography of a life that is comfortable, dispersed, and carefully distanced from the palace world he grew up inside. He remains connected to the world of design and art through his long association with Christie's, where he served as honorary chairman for Europe, the Middle East, Russia, and India, though the Linley Company he founded at 23, the company that was supposed to be the proof that a child of the Snowden marriage could build something lasting with his own hands, is no longer under his control. That loss was not dramatic. It was financial, practical, the kind of thing that happens to many small businesses. But it carried a symbolic weight that David, more than most people, would have felt. He is 26th in the line of succession to the British throne, high enough to be counted, far enough from the center to confirm what the entire story has demonstrated. This branch of the Windsors was never destined for power, only for proximity to it, and everything that proximity costs. His son, Charles Armstrong-Jones, styled as Viscount Linley since inheriting the courtesy title upon his father's succession to the earldom, studied product design engineering at Loughborough University, a choice that echoes his father's and his grandfather's commitment to making things, to the craft of shaping material into useful and beautiful form. His daughter, Margarita, named for the grandmother who died just weeks before she was born, studied jewelry design and stone setting at the Haute École de Joaillerie in Paris. The creative inheritance continues, expressed in new materials and new disciplines, but carrying the same fundamental impulse that David discovered in the woodwork shop at Bedales half a century ago, to make something tangible, something real, something that cannot betray you the way an image can. Neither of David's children has sought public attention. Neither trades on the royal connection. The pattern of discretion, established in the crisis of 1976, continues into the third generation. Lady Sarah Chatto is 61 years old. She lives in London with Daniel, her husband of more than 30 years. A marriage that has endured in the quietest possible way, without headlines, without crises, without the kind of public drama that consumed her parents' union and eventually reached her brothers. She continues to paint and exhibit as Sarah Armstrong-Jones, the name she has always used for her work, and her constellation of roles at the Royal Ballet, the Royal Ballet School, and Birmingham Royal Ballet has given her a public dimension that connects her with profound specificity to the one part of her mother's legacy that was most worth preserving. She is also vice president of the Royal Drawing School and patron of the Frederick Ashton Foundation, positions that confirm her standing in the arts world as something earned through sustained engagement rather than merely inherited through title. She is not a working royal. She does not undertake official public duties, but she is present at family gatherings, at Sandringham at Christmas, at the ceremonial occasions that punctuate the calendar of the extended royal family, and her presence carries a quality that anyone who has followed this story will recognize. Composed, watchful, neither seeking the spotlight nor retreating from it, occupying her position with the deliberate modesty that has characterized her entire adult life. What is absent is as visible as what remains. Princess Margaret is gone, dead at 71, cremated, her ashes resting beside her father's in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor. Snowden is gone, dead at 86, his photographs in the National Portrait Gallery, his title inherited by the son he raised and the son he hid. The Queen Mother is gone, dead at 101, 7 weeks after Margaret, the matriarch whose code of warmth and silence had shaped the emotional climate of the entire family. Queen Elizabeth II, who held the institution together through decades of scandal, change, and loss, died at Balmoral on the 8th of September, 2022, and with her passing, the last of the generation that had known Margaret as a sister and a contemporary departed from the stage. The apartment at Kensington Palace, where the family was formed and fractured, and where Margaret spent her final diminished years, has been reassigned. Les Jolies Eaux on Mustique, the house of escape, the house of scandal, the house where the first stroke came, was sold in 2003. The physical settings of the story have been emptied of the people who inhabited them, and what remains is not a dynasty in any traditional sense, but two lives, David's and Sarah's, that carry the weight of everything that came before while declining, with a consistency that amounts to a philosophy, to let the weight become visible. The children of a spare royal do not inherit a throne. They do not inherit a constitutional role or a set of duties that give their sacrifices meaning. What they inherit is everything that accrues around proximity to one: the visibility, the expectation, the silence, the emotional distortion, the weight of a name that is famous without being powerful, and the requirement to look composed while the adults around them fracture. David and Sarah Armstrong-Jones grew up inside that inheritance. They breathed it in through the walls of Kensington Palace, absorbed it at Sandringham Christmases and Balmoral summers, felt it in the gap between the family the cameras saw and the family that existed behind the closed doors of apartment 1A. Their real fate, the fate the documentary's title promises to reveal, is not that they were destroyed in public as their mother was. It is not that they became tabloid figures, repeating the cycle of scandal and exposure that had consumed the previous generation. Their fate is subtler and in its way more revealing. They learned very early the value of lives built outside the main beam of royal light. They learned that craft and painting and privacy and chosen marriages were not failures of ambition, but forms of survival. And they spent their adulthood constructing, with patience and discipline and discretion that has held for more than 40 years, exactly the kinds of lives their childhood had taught them to need. That is not a lesson. It is not a moral. It is just what became necessary. If you found this story worth your time, please like and subscribe so you never miss another.